So good morning, thank you for being here. First talk, second day, so I appreciate it. Thank you again to the organizers and for the hospitality. It's been a very interesting workshop. So I changed the title of my talk because I wanted to broaden the scope a bit and I'll explain why and how in a minute. So I'll be looking at the case of color specifically, as the title very straightforwardly explains. So when it comes to color, the question broadly seems to be, does color knowledge modulate or affect, shape color information processing? So by color knowledge, we seem to mean basically the name of colors, so how we name the colors of individual t-shirts on this shirt, so on this slide, so blue or green or whatever. And also the color of objects, so the color that we expect certain objects to have. So I know that this apple is red. And by color information, we mean a lot of things. So non-exhaustively, we mean surface level processing, which will help basically recognize objects and, of course, categorizing them, so this improves this kind of performance. But we mean all sorts of things as well, like knowing that color is processed along with spatial frequency, orientation, contour, and knowing also that color enhances performance in perception of shading, in visual scene, structure detection, so there's all of that. Now, it seems to be, color knowledge seems to be very relevant in the first case, because there seems to be evidence or suggestions that color knowledge understood in this very minimal sense might actually affect the way we process surface color information, to the extent that it helps basically object recognition and categorization. So these are actually the two areas in color research where most of the evidence might seem to stem in support of color penetration. The first area we can broadly call color and lexicon. So it's the idea that lexical categorization or color lexicon might affect the way we perceive color, but not exactly the way we perceive color, the way we perceive the distance, the perceptual distance between colors, specifically colored chips, because this is how this is measured with actual abstract chips and not actual objects. And this effect is called categorical perception of color. The second broad area of research was mentioned briefly yesterday. We can label color and objects, and that's basically the idea that our knowledge of the typical color of an object might affect the way we perceive that color, or basically might affect the apparent color of that object. And this goes under the label of memory color mostly in literature. So I will try to cover both these areas. I think it's a bit ambitious, so I don't know how much time I'll have, but that's the plan, so we'll see how this goes. I will start with the first part, which is lexicon. So for those of you who are not familiar with the phenomenon, a very brief introduction. Categorical perception effects were introduced in the context of color categorization. And color categorization is this very broad or densely researched area regarding where our color categories come from. Are they supported by perceptual and cognitive mechanisms, or are they rather shaped by language? This is a very large debate that I'm sure all of you have heard of. And in order to assess whether or not lexicon affects discrimination performance at boundaries, we first need to identify categories. And these are identified generally in naming tasks. And so you have first, this is a Mansell system, which is used in most cases of studies of color naming. You have a three-dimensional representation of the solid, which, as you can see, is not a perfect sphere. And then you have a two-dimensional projection, mercator projection of the external skin, if you like, of the solid, which consists of the most saturated chips, varying along hue and brightness. So what we do is we ask people to name these chips presented individually in a random order, and then we will identify the color term that is used most frequently in association to one chip, and then we get this kind of partitioning of the same color chart, which gives us an idea basically of how this group of population name colors. So interestingly, in the Mansell system, which is why it's also very much used, apart from the fact that these are chips, so it's very practical in fieldwork, the perceptual distance between the chips are supposed to be equal. So on that, well, I'm not going to get into details of whether or not it's the case, but assuming that's the case, so on that chart, every square represents a chip, and the distance, the perceptual distance between each chip and the adjacent chip in the two dimensions is equal. So the whole idea of categorical perception is to test whether the discrimination performance between chips that are within green or within blue and across that boundary. So if you take the 4 chips, let me use a pointer. So if we test it between this chip, these 4 chips here, the perceptual distance between these 4 is the same. The question is whether people will be quicker at that boundary here, knowing that there is no physical reason for them to be quicker. So in these studies, it is crucial that the perceptual distance between the chips is actually objectively the same. So, and actually it's not the case in a lot of studies. This kind of control is not done in a lot of studies, but that's a point I will not be discussing here. So, category perception effects have been studied in various ways, mostly behavioral evidence for the past 2-3 decades. And this is a summary of the kind of paradigms that have been used. In some cases, memory is involved. In some cases, memory is not involved. Apologies in advance for this cough. So, for example, in the first two top rows, memory is involved. So a target is presented, and then distractor and target, or just distractor, is presented. And so based on how the participant remembers the color, they will discriminate and say it's the same, it's different, that's most different. And then, of course, target and distractor will be either across the boundary, the lexical boundary, or within, and we will compare the discrimination performance in both cases. In other kinds of paradigms, which are more interesting because they do not involve memory and therefore more directly measure perceptual experience, you have the 2 bottom type of paradigms. So in any case, you need to identify the most different, in both in the odd man out or individual search task, you have to identify the most different target, the most different color. And so we typically get this kind of result. This is taken from a very influential, very cited study on the so-called Russian blues. So Russian seems to have 2 terms in the blue area, one for light blue, one for dark blue, whereas English does not. And so this study is a comparison of categorical perception effects or discrimination performance in both languages on that boundary. So forget about the fact that English participants are overall faster. What's interesting is the difference across the 2 conditions, within or across boundary. So if you look at the Russian results, so that's this, sorry, wrong button, I guess. Yeah, here. Here. So this is cross-category discrimination, this is within category discrimination, and in this case we're looking at reaction times, and there seems to be a very significant advantage at the lexical boundary. So Russians are quicker at discriminating between light blue and dark blue than within light blue or within dark blue, and this is an advantage we do not observe with English speakers who do not have this kind of lexical boundary. So this is a typical pattern of category perception effect. Now, of course, the whole question is if it's perceptual or not. Is categorical perception really perceptual? That's a very large debate in that literature. And so that's why a lot of studies have been conducting interference tasks. So the result I first showed you is a discrimination task with no interference. They just show the chips and they discriminate. Now, 2 other kind of tasks were conducted with an interference. The first was a spatial interference, and the second is a verbal interference. In the case of the spatial interference, discrimination task is the same, except that we show them first a pattern, like a checkerboard, black and white in this case, if I remember correctly, that they have to remember, because at the end of the task, they will be asked to identify among several patterns which is the one that they were first shown. In the case of the verbal interference, they're shown, I think in this case, as a string of numbers or words. Again, they have to memorize them, because at the end of the task, they will be asked among several possibilities which is the string of words or numbers that they were shown. So they need to commit these numbers or words to memory. Very interestingly, as you can see here, in the case of the spatial interference task, the performance is the same. So they're still able to discriminate at the light blue, dark blue lexical boundary. However, when it comes to the verbal interference task, this advantage disappears. So as you can see here, this is a cross-category performance, and it's not quicker than the within-category performance as it is in these 2 cases here. In English, nothing happens. It's the same. It's overall slower, but it's the same performance when it comes to a cross-category and within-category. So this is a very interesting result, and it's not the only study that has relied on these interference tasks, because actually it sheds light on the role of language in these category perception or discrimination tasks. So in light of these kinds of results, because of course it's not the only study that have shown that, people have basically suggested that category perception seems to rely on what is called a lexical strategy. So, taking this diagram, which I think is a very good illustration, here the idea would be that, again, sorry. Yeah. So in the diagram here, the idea would be that declarative memory shapes perception, and then perception, thereby modulated by lexicon, will inform the perceptual decision during discrimination. So that would be your kind of top-down effect. However, the fact that the verbal interference disrupts the performance speaks in favor of this diagram here. So because verbal interference seems to sever this link here, where declarative memory not being accessed during performance can no longer inform the perceptual discrimination, and therefore the categorical advantage is no longer observed with a verbal interference task. So this is basically why people have, for a long time, accounted for category perception effects in terms of lexical strategy. So this is for the behavioral evidence that we have seen over and over again for decades. Now, recently, a new kind of evidence has been provided, this time relying on electrophysiological recordings. Here we are looking at evoked response potentials. So basically, as people look at colors or discriminate, electrodes are placed on their scalps, and we look at waveforms and their patterns and their timings. And based on the timings, we can tell if it's a low-level or high-level event. So it's very interesting for the question we're trying to look at, because we're trying to determine if it's a perceptual or a post-perceptual phenomenon. So before I get into that specific study, I just need to explain where the idea comes from. So there is a phenomenon called mismatch negativity that has been observed in audition very clearly. And recently it has been argued that this kind of pattern, of response pattern, is also observed in vision. The idea is, interestingly, is that when there's a pattern that is violated by an irregularity, there is a particular kind of waveform that will react to this pattern change. And that basically reaction is based on a memory of pattern and not on different refractoriness states. So it's not like different neurons will become unresponsive differently to different stimuli. It's rather that there's a pattern that is disrupted, and it's this disruption based on memory that will cause the effect. So you can see how this is very interesting in the case of category perception, because then this is exactly what we want to show. So this study is taken to actually show that visual mismatch negativity really exists. So you have a regular repetition. You can see like 2 red and black squares, 2 green and black again, etc. And then you have an irregular repetition where suddenly a 3rd green and black square is introduced. And this provokes this kind of response. So this is the waveform we're looking at. The negativity response is here, and then it peaks again. And this happens quite early on, around 90 milliseconds or something like that, after stimulus onset. And this is basically the location of the electrode, so in the occipital area, so very close to coronary visual cortex. This is very interesting because it's independent of stimulus energy, it's independent of attention, it's independent of processing load. It just depends on the magnitude change. So it depends on how different or how basically violated the pattern is. So the first ones to have used this to test for category perception are Fontenot and Davidoff in a 2007 paper. It was a very smart idea. They wanted to reproduce visual mismatch negativity as much as possible, which is why in their task, they wanted people not to attend to color, which is why the task was to detect infrequent cartoon characters. But in fact, they embedded the cartoon characters in colors, in color pattern, the different kind of colors, and they told them that the colors were just to make the cartoons more vivid, so people reported not attending to colors at all. And then they looked at basically how the brain reacted to the presentations of these colors. Now, the idea here is to have 6 blocks. I'm showing you 3 of them because it's just important to understand what's going on. So in block 1, you have a standard, which they call G0, so it's one kind of green, and a divined, which is red in this case. In block 3, the standard is also G0. The divined this time is blue, so it's less different than red compared to G0. And then in the 5th block, the standard is again G0, and the divined is a second kind of green that they call G1. Of course, here, the perceptual distance between G0 blue and G1 and G0 is the same. So between block 3 and block 5, the physical magnitude of the change is the same. between the divine and the standard. However, of course, with red, the magnitude of the change is larger. So the whole question is, will the perceptual system detect that blue is more different than green? If it does, it means that the lexical boundary is actually represented very early on in the processing system. If it doesn't, then it means that it's just a later process. So it's a very interesting way of testing for the question. And this is the result. So these are the results. So in the first chart, this is where red is defined, then blue and then green are defined. So this is how it's represented. The gray bar in the middle is an indication of where the curve that represents the response to divines and the curve that represents the response to standard are significantly different. So in the case of red, so you can see, I don't know if it's visible, the dark curve here is standard, and the dotted or lighter curve is the divine. So this is where they come apart, and this difference is significant. And here is the significance, in this case it's here. So for red, it's triggered at 120 milliseconds all the way to 160 milliseconds. In blue, it starts later, 160 to 200 milliseconds. And in green, it starts at 160 again, and it's all the way to 280. So Fontenot and Davidoff take this result to be very interesting because there is a difference between blue and green. So that's the very first interesting result. Knowing that the magnitude of the change again is the same in these cases between standard and divine, so this is an interesting outcome. And they interpret the latency here, because it's a much longer kind of curve going all the way from 160 to 280, as basically the system taking more time to process that this is a within category difference rather than a between category difference, as in the case of blue. So it's a very interesting study, and I mean, it's very innovative, and it does show something interesting. Its main limitation is that the timings don't really correspond to what we would have hoped. So if you take this description of the visual processing flow, perceptual processing basically is roughly up all the way up to 150 milliseconds. Again, these are not hard boundaries. The timings here are more it's the timing of the onset of a particular waveform. So it's not the beginning or the end of a phase. It's rather the characteristic waveform of that phase that is that starts at that time. Whereas what we observed with Fontenot and Davidoff is rather a waveform that starts at 160 milliseconds and more when it comes to blue and green. So it seems likely that it's more of a post-perceptual processing rather than a perceptual processing. Which is why another study was conducted, this time by Holmes and colleagues, so another team. This time they didn't care about attention or reproducing visual mismatch negativity. They had several tasks, and in the ERP recordings, they just showed colors. Participants were asked to do absolutely nothing, just look at the screen, and they just recorded what happened in the cortex, of course, after establishing that that was really the boundary. So in this case, it's a triad. So you have either two greens and one blue, or two blues and one green, so represented in this here. So these are the standards, and these are two divines, and the same here, standards and divines. And then we look at, again, how the system reacts. And in this case, we observe responses much earlier. So what they were hoping to see is precisely that, what they call the P1 and the N1 components, which are triggered here. And you can see the difference between the different kind of curves. The black curve is the standard reaction to the standard. The light gray curve is the between category, and this is the within category. And you can see that the onset, the time is different. So it seems like when it comes to the between category discrimination, the onset of the curve is 90 milliseconds after stimuli presentation, and when it's within discrimination, it's at 96 milliseconds. Now, this is very interesting because this would mean that there's something at the perceptual level that's going on this time. Unlike in the Davidoff and Fontenot study, this is clearly within what we could call perceptual and not post-perceptual processing. So this is a very interesting and promising result in favor of what? That's the question. Because what the finding is really is that we see a signature of some sort of categorical effect at a very low level, but this doesn't really tell us that this is due to language. Because that study doesn't control for another lexical boundary, and it doesn't compare to another language where this category does not exist. For example, the rainbow we saw earlier does not have two lexical categories, one for blue and for green. So we would need some sort of comparison to make sure that the boundary there is really lexical, because don't forget that these kinds of studies are in the context of categorization, which main question of which, what are the mechanisms of categorization? Is it hardwired or is it acquired? And in fact, for the blue-green boundary specifically, there is evidence that shows that this could be actually, I don't like the word hardwired, which is why I put quotation marks, but it looks like there is something that is perceptually determined when it comes to the sensitivity at that specific boundary. So developmental data shows that infants in a habituation paradigm will be faster at fixating at a target on a background that is across boundary than within the same category. And also we have electrophysiological recordings with infants that are like 7 months also pre-linguistic, and these are these results here, where these components here, the central negativity and the slow wave component here, show that this is allocation of attention to what they consider a novel event, and this is also a signature of a novel event being detected. And this novel event is none other but a cross-category divined versus a within-category divined. So there are reasons to believe on the basis of developmental data, that blue-green boundary is somewhat special. And this is true of adults as well. So there's a series of fascinating papers by Witzed and Gegenferker between 2013 and 2018, where they actually basically examined the relationship between perceptual sensitivity and categorization. In this case, the stimuli are extremely controlled, and what they're using is the Dirichlet cross-scales and Lenny space, which represents actually second stage mechanisms. So unlike one cell system, it's not about how humans experience color, it's rather about how the opponent mechanism basically reacts to light. So it's really based on sensitivity of cones, and this is how the model was created. And then participants are asked to discriminate between something like 72 colors that are adjacent, and the point is to detect just noticeable difference and see how the just noticeable difference varies across the color circle, basically. Now, just noticeable difference, or JNDs, for those of you who are not familiar with the notion, is basically the point at which the difference between two colors starts to be visible to the human eye. And what they see is that actually, if you look at that curve here, the sensitivity thresholds are lower at blue-green boundary and at pink-orange boundary. Now, there is no red there because that circle is isoluminant, so luminance was kept constant to avoid any interference from luminance change, and that's why at that luminance there is no red, so it's rather like a pink. So if you look at that curve here, very interestingly, the curve here represents the sensitivity thresholds, whereas the dots and the lines are the categorization data that they also collected with the same participants because they were careful to look at within participant data. So because people have different JNDs and different categories, so they looked at both within and across participant data. So as you can see here, the boundary between blue and green is exactly at the lowest point of sensitivity between blue and green. And this is also true for pink and orange, but it's not true for the other categories. So it would seem like lowest sensitivity thresholds when it comes to the blue-green boundary and the pink-orange boundary in the study seem to play a role in lexical categorization, but that's not true of the other boundaries. So in that case, they're arguing for like a loose relationship between perceptual sensitivity and categorization, but closer to our interests here, this means that the blue-green boundary is also perceptually perhaps determined, and therefore to really be convincingly arguing that it's language that is causing the effects we saw. We need to control for other boundaries or for languages that do not have this boundary specifically. All right. So to conclude on color and lexicon, we saw behavioral data that suggests that language informs perceptual decision. We saw neurophysiological recordings that show that CP effects are manifested very early on, but the nature of the effect is not clear because there is doubt on the nature of the blue-green boundary. All right, so now I'm going to move on to the second part. So this study, maybe some of you know, because I think it's a bit more directly connected to the cognitive penetration literature, and it was mentioned briefly yesterday. There has been a series of studies by the team of researchers, including actually Gegenferker, to which I referred earlier, regarding what we call memory color, which is memory color is basically knowledge of the typical color of an object that is acquired through frequent exposition to that object. What they did is they used these photographs of fruit and vegetable, which all have typical colors, And they also manipulated these photographs to create these other stimuli here, which are three-dimensional but lack any kind of texture information, and the color is averaged between luminance and chromaticity. And here, these are just flat outlines. And so they showed these photographs of fruit to participants. They were shown in random order, in random color, and participants needed to set, there were two tasks. First, they needed to set these fruit to their typical color, and then they needed to set these fruit to an achromatic point. So it was the cancelling task. They needed to get to gray. So the hypothesis is, if memory color does occur, then when the banana is actually gray, I would still perceive it as being yellowish, and therefore to cancel the yellow component, I will need to go further in the opposite direction, which is blue. And therefore, then we can measure how far further away from the gray point they went. And so these are the results. These are the typical color settings as expected. And then, very interestingly, instead of getting here, this is the physical, objectively gray point, the achromatic setting was beyond the gray point in what looks like the opposite direction. So this is a very interesting finding in favor of memory color. This was replicated with different kind of objects, three-dimensional, but they needed more colors because there are no blue fruits, not enough anyway in nature, and no purple is not as well. So they wanted to look at three-dimensional different colors, two-dimensional objects, and flat, untextured images. And they find the same kind of result. In this case, this is represented differently. These bars are what they call memory color index. It's kind of ratio between the index, the typical color, and the compensation. And so you can see that the effect is particularly high for blue and yellow, not bad for purple, much lower for the other colors, and actually inexistent or for red and orange, and very low for green. So I'll get back to that later, but overall we do observe some sort of effect in this case as well. So before discussing these results, I'm going to continue with another memory color study, and then I can discuss everything together. This is another study by Lupian. The idea is similar to the one we saw earlier, that is using a cancellation task to basically assess whether or not memory colors has a sort of effect. In this case, we're looking at after images. The idea behind the study is that after images should be affected by whether or not we know the color of an object. So if I'm familiar with an object and I am aware of, I shouldn't say I'm aware, if I know, let's say, the color of this object, then the after image of that object should be more vivid than if I didn't know the color. So the paradigm is as follows. Participants are habituated to one inducer. This is the inverse of the natural color of that castle scene. They're habituated to that. They'll experience the after image on overlay of that gray image that's presented on screen. And they need to cancel their after image experience by basically adding in inverse color on that image that appears behind the after image. Does that make any sense? Yeah? All right. And so we measure the vividness of the after image by seeing how much color, how much opposite colors they needed to add in. In this case, there's only one dimension that they can play on, whereas in the Okunen and colleagues and Witzel papers, there were two dimensions, so just one knob up and down, basically. And so the prediction was as follows. So for objects like bananas that have a typical color, the after image would be more vivid, whereas t-shirts that could be of any color, the after image would be weaker. The same for the castle here. Upright, the castle should be vivid, and upside down, the castle should not be vivid. So following the same idea here. And that's what they observe, when he observes, because Lupian is the only author of this paper. So broccoli, bananas, and pumpkins which have a typical color have a more vivid after image than couches, t-shirts, and cars that could be of any color. And this you can see here. So objects with an intrinsic color are more vivid than objects with an arbitrary color. And the same holds for the upright versus upside down castle. The upright castle in conventional color leads to the most vivid after image. So, there seems to be, so based on these studies, it looks like there is something going on with memory colors. It's very much in favor. At least there's an interesting question that is raised. But there are a few other questions that are raised as well. So in the first study by Okunen and colleagues, what we observed is that actually, when it comes to flat outlines, the effect is almost insignificant. So if it was really conceptual, effect, if it was knowledge in the sense of a concept or semantic content that would affect the perception, then we could expect this to happen even with outlines, because outlines also suggest the fruit, and we know the color of the fruit, but we only observe that with actual photographs. So people have said maybe they're more recognizable here and there. People have said, well, because it's not a conceptual effect, but more of a perceptual effect. Even more interestingly is this observation here. So in this first chart here, you have typical color settings. You can see that they're more or less around the circle. This is achromatic settings, and you can see that they're kind of all converging on the yellow-blue axis. So this has led with other colleagues in this paper to discuss the possibility that, in fact, as people were cancelling, it's not only the memory color effect that was playing a role, but also the daylight, color of daylight. Because not only the fruits were beyond the gray point, but also the neutral discs that were there for control. They were consistently shifted towards blue. So there seems to be something about the way our system has incorporated, let's say, the color of daylight that is mostly either very yellow, because if it's direct sunlight, or bluish if there is diffusion of blue light through Rayleigh scattering. So this is also the second point. And in line with that idea is the fact that not all objects of all colors basically manifest the same kind of effect. You could see that for blue and yellow, the effect was much larger than for red and green and orange. So this raises a question of what exactly is going on in that cancellation task. Knowing that Kimura and al. Have shown that this effect is also observed with red. So there are a lot of questions there still. Now, the other question regards the notion of memory color itself, because the word memory is misleading. So people seem to confuse memory color with color memory, as I'll be saying in a while. But Witzel and colleagues themselves basically warn us as to how we can use this result, because memory color might well be itself a very low-level effect. For example, if the daylight hypothesis holds, it's not something we are aware of, it's not something we remember, it's rather a perceptual system that has integrated this information in the way so it's more like a perceptual memory, not a memory like we're committing to memory something. So this is why they make this distinction, and it's not clear actually in Lupian's paper what is being tested. Is it memory color, is it color memory, and what would need actually to be, what is needed for an argument in favor of cognitive penetration. Now, in the case of Lupian's study, there's another interesting thing to take into consideration, and that's after images mechanisms themselves. So after images are produced in two phases. In the first phase, polarity-sensitive cells will react, and they will basically be the structure of the after image, because the darkness and lightness will be inverted. And in the second phase, polarity-insensitive cells are activated, and these are the ones that modulate basically the strength of the after image. Now, interestingly, if polarity-insensitive cells are highly activated in the second phase, this is when the after image is strong. If polarity-insensitive cells are not highly activated in the second phase, then the after image is weak or inexistent. And now, the reason why polarity-insensitive cells might not be activated in the second phase is if they were activated in the first phase, because then they are unresponsive during the second phase. And actually, deployment of selective attention in the first phase will make them activate in the first phase and therefore not activate in the second phase, and therefore lead to a weak or an inexistent after image. Now, if participants are attending more to the object during the first phase in that study, then this will lead to a weak after image. Now, we know that unfamiliar and novel objects are attended more than familiar ones. Of course, here the notion of attended needs to be examined, because there are various understandings here. But what's interesting is that we have a symmetrical explanation that is very low level as well. So, according to Lupian, familiarity would explain strong after images, but according to von Goxel and colleagues, unfamiliarity would explain weak after images. So we have a perfectly also possibly valid explanation of the same result. All right, so actually I was good on time. I hope I wasn't too fast. I tend to be. So to conclude, we have basically understood color knowledge in terms of lexicon and typical color of an object. And we have focused on the first point, which is surface color processing, object recognition, and categorization. But there is more to color information processing, or to color information that needs to be taken into account, and that I have non-exhaustively listed here. So I guess the question is, if color is cognitively penetrated by color knowledge, is this true of all kind of color information, including contour, shape of shading, all of these effects? And if not, why would it be only one type of color processing and not other types of color processing? And if it is the case, is it the same kind of knowledge that would affect color across the board? And more importantly, why? What's the benefit? Why would color information processing be modulated by knowledge? I mean, if we go with the idea that a perceptual system is meant to be efficient, then we are basically justified in trying to believe that there is a reason why this would make the system more efficient. But it's not clear to me yet why it would be more efficient for a system to be cognitively penetrated, except in the case of object recognition and categorization that I mentioned earlier. So again, there's one thing that we should be aware of, is that the data I've discussed is part of different discussions, right? Of course, this data suggests that there might be some top-down effects, but they have to be taken into context. It's part of the color categorization debate, and it's a question about innate versus language acquisition mechanisms in categorization in categorization, or it's about color constancy, which has its own questions as well, where the role of memory, color, and color constancy is actually not clear, and there are loads of other questions in this very unresolved actually mechanisms. So the question of why color would be penetrated needs to be addressed independently. This is what I'm trying to say from these kinds of areas of research. And I'm done. Thank you.